Here on KGRA Radio, welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. Last week, my guests were Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, the world's leading researchers into the remarkable story of a crashed UFO and the retrieval of that UFO near the town of Aztec, New Mexico in March 1948. And I say remarkable, but I think that's an understatement. The case has been so misunderstood for so long, and this is the result of a few factors. First, since this event took place 9 months after the crash of a UFO at Roswell, it's now clear that the U.S. military was becoming better at managing the process efficiently and with much better secrecy. Secondly, the story was victim to an incredibly successful smear campaign initiated by a writer named J.P. Cahn, who very clearly wrote what he did out of a vindictiveness because he wasn't able to get access to the story himself. The smear worked for the remainder of the 20th century and still is taken as the truth in sources of establishment-controlled media. Just check the terrible article on the Aztec UFO event in Wikipedia. However, the Ramseys have done the heroic work of not only rehabilitating the case, or anyone who's got a brain to look at the facts of the case, but also in demonstrating just how important this case is in the overall history of the UFO subject. So I'm back with the Ramseys. This is the second interview in my series with them, and there will be a third. We cover a lot of ground here. In this program, we discuss a few more interesting elements of the recovery of the disc itself, including some very strange qualities or properties of the craft which precluded any scientist from being inside it for more than 15 or 20 minutes maximum without suffering severe biological effects. Really interesting. But then we move on into a discussion of how the story itself got into the hands of the author Frank Scully and how another writer, J.P. Cahn, smeared the whole effort. We also discuss the very strong interest of the FBI into this whole matter. You don't want to miss this one. Let's jump right in. In the last segment, we you guys really gave a nice description of a lot of the timeline, what happened, then what happened, then what happened, of this amazing UFO event that was hidden for so many years. And you guys really get the credit for reviving and bringing this story back to life. Can we talk a little bit more about some of the things that we didn't get a chance to cover in our last segment? And for listeners who have not heard the first segment of this interview, I would encourage them to listen to that first before this one, because that really lays all of the groundwork for what we're about to talk about here. But for example, we didn't get into some of the real personal details, like the preacher, Dolan Brown, who was on the site, or just the manner of how the craft itself somehow was disassembled enough that it could be transported out of Hart Canyon. And a lot of these details is really quite fascinating, and we didn't get a chance. So I wonder if we can go into that now.
There was, at the end, or during the day of the actual incident, the military had come in, all of the witnesses had been dismissed, and that were on the mesa, and there was a traveling minister, circuit minister, Baptist minister, that was going from Aztec up to Mancos, Colorado. And as he was driving by, he saw a lot of activity down the road, and he thought maybe there was an accident or an injury or something. So he drove down there just to see if he could help out. Upon arriving to the site, he explained who he was, and he said, "Can I help? Has there been an injury or an accident? I see all this activity." And they said, "Yes, you can help if you'll join us up here." And as they walked to the top of the mesa, there were the 16 bodies laying there. And Reverend Brown walked over, and you can imagine, to his surprise, he had no idea what they were going to ask him to do. And they said, "Could you say some prayers?" And he said, "Well, I'm not a priest. I can't give last rites." But he said, "I could say some prayers." And so he did. And he was so shook up. Once he finished, he got in his car and he drove back to Mancos. Well, it's a little bit up through the mountains. And when he returned, he called some of his parishioners friends that were his in the parish, and asked them to come over, and they were all in a room, and he said, he was obviously very shook up, and he said, I have had an experience today that I just need to share. And they said, okay, and he proceeded to tell them what his experience was, and he began to cry. And one of the folks in the room, the gentleman said, kind of cleared his throat, just harmlessly cleared his throat, and the minister became even more upset, and he said, you don't believe me, this is a life-changing experience, and I can't believe that you'd, in other words, make fun of me. And it changed his life. There was a child in the room, and we were able to discuss with the child years later about what was said and how this was handled. So there's another person that sure didn't go looking for this by any means.
In your book, actually, as I recall, he said that. You don't believe me, but wasn't it the person he was speaking to, I guess, was a deacon who said, no, I believe you. I'm just trying to process all of this, or I'm in shock, or something like that. So it's worth remembering. Yeah, fascinating detail. All of these human interaction. That's the incredible thing. We're dealing with something that presumably is extraterrestrial, or it's certainly not from our civilization, but we are human beings, and we react to these things in a very deeply emotional and often traumatized way, as this preacher, Dolan Brown, did. So it's really quite interesting. Can you describe any other details of the crash site? For example, any other details about these beings? Last segment, you described them as childlike, not particularly alien in the sense that they were not like gray aliens that everyone knows what a gray alien looks like with the big black wraparound eyes. These did not have that. They were much more childlike. You mentioned in the previous segment they had perfect teeth. That's interesting because grays are never described as having teeth, even a mouth practically. Right. So these were different, but they presumably weren't normal humans. They were 3.5, 4 feet tall, and they weren't children. Were their heads a little larger than normal, or did you not get that information? Was it not that clear to you?
I didn't get that information. Going back to Bill Steinman's book, Frank Scully's book, and many conversations I've had with Bill until he passed. Yeah. Starting with Scully, I guess, they seem to have had some kind of freeze-dried food on board, for the lack of a better description. Wafer-like objects that you could put in water and it would greatly expand. And that was some kind of protein source. Scully also refers to pamphlets that were like a parchment-type paper. And Steinman independently had that in his book as well, from some of the people he interviewed. Bill Steinman does not get enough credit for the incredible research that he did. Unfortunately, a lot of his research did not make it into his book for a lot of different reasons. But I never personally talked to any witness that talked about wafers or parchment paper. One of the best cryptologists at the time was a Dr. Friedman, spelled just like Stan Friedman. And then there was a second gentleman, it escapes my mind right now, but Suzanne and I went to D.C. and interviewed his son that thought that the father had worked on some extraterrestrial type of writings.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, he came to a local UFO conference and came with some of his buddies retired from the NSA and CIA. So the son kind of followed in Daddy's footsteps and staying in the intelligence industry. He was retired, but said that he had thought that his dad had worked on some type of recovered craft over the years. We have not put that in the book, but we interviewed the son, firsthand.
That's fascinating,
but,
too.
As far as any of our witnesses, I don't believe. I'd have to search the notes. We have 2.5 to almost 3 hours of Ken Farley on tape, but I don't know from memory if he recalled any of that paper.
Yeah, well, we're dealing with actually several generations of researchers into Aztec. I mean, there's the two of you, along with Frank Thayer and Frank Warren, by the way. Let's give them credit for the work that they did with you. But also, before you mentioned Bill Steinman. And then before Steinman, we don't have to go into detail here, but there was a man named Robert Carr, a professor who I know corresponded with Leonard Stringfield back in the 60s and 70s. This man,
late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah, he was researching Aztec, and he's sort of a missing link to this. The vague impressions that I got from Stringfield's writing is that Carr did some very good work. He actually did some good research.
Yeah.
And then prior to him was Scully. So there's different researchers getting different versions or maybe getting different witnesses. And so it actually does make sense, doesn't it, that there would be variations in various accounts of what happened at Aztec. We're talking about a variety of investigations that took place over, 50 years. So it really shouldn't surprise us that there might be, one emphasis here, that Scully might have gotten this, or maybe that Carr got something, or Bill Steinman got something, and so on. But anyway, this is something that actually struck me as maybe one of the most odd things about the Aztec crash and recovery, which is how the craft apparently divided into three segments with a fourth segment detaching. So how did that happen, to the best of what your witnesses told you?
I follow the original writings of Frank Scully, and just to give your audience a little heads up, his book is still available. It actually was reprinted. It's called Behind the Flying Saucers. And unknown to many people, a second book by Scully was written. And probably a third of that book, it talks about Aztec, J.P. Cahn, and all the trial they went through.
We're going to get into all of that very soon, by the way.
That book is titled In Armor Bright. It's really the highlights of Frank Scully's life, written by Frank Scully. A third book by Frank Scully was written on the Aztec incident, which we have a copy of, the manuscript, but for whatever reason, he never published it. And we found it at the University of Wyoming in Laramie in the archives. And it's an incredible book, and a lot of that will be in our third book.
Oh, wonderful.
It's really good information. Getting back to how the craft came apart, there are things called a pib pin. Pib pin. They're used to hold the wings on an Indy car. It's a pin with a push button and a ball bearing. You'd have to look it up on the internet to see what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of ours, Mike Price, who we talked about earlier, he has an aerobatic stunt plane at the decathlon, and the wing struts are all held on with a pib pin. And listening to how Frank Scully described how the craft came apart, it was almost like the craft was held together by a series of round pib pins. They talk about after getting down in the belly of the craft, they found round pins that held the craft together. And the center section, which was the dome, came out. And then the three sections, we'll call them pie pieces for the lack of a better word. So you would end up having four pieces of the craft. Now, keeping in mind it was 99.9 feet in diameter, which going around that's roughly 314 feet.
Yeah,
still pretty large. Doing the reenactment, which we ended up having to do, as Suzanne was saying earlier, we knew we couldn't write a book unless we addressed how do you get even three pie-shaped pieces that large off the mesa and use the roads that are available to you and use the technology from 1948, not 2012 when we did this. So we started by hiring the world's best mover of high-wide objects. And he's retired. He lives in Confluence, Pennsylvania. His name's Bill Metzger. And Bill was the leading expert on how to move large things, turbines, boilers, large motors, generators, huge transformers, that type of thing.
Okay.
I know he was the best because he worked for my father. That's what my dad did for a living.
Aha.
So we brought Bill and his lovely wife, Pam, and Suzanne and I out to the desert.
But I might interrupt just a moment, honey. When we were looking for the right person to do the job and we brought it up to Bill, in none of these cases are we ever looking for someone that's going to be a yes man. We weren't looking for someone that believes, quote unquote, in flying saucers. We were looking for someone that will just give us the fact. And when we actually approached him, his statement was, well, I don't buy any of that. And all we could say was, good deal.
Good.
That's exactly what we're
We
looking
said, good, you're hired. He has no interest in the whole field of ufology or whatever we call it today. But we all met for a week, 7 days out in Aztec. And with pinch poles, with tape measures, we went right to the concrete slab, old maps of what roads were there in 1948. And we reinvented, re-engineered, and reenacted moving the segments of the craft. And although there were a few times, you got to take erosion into consideration and whatnot, there were a few times we cleared by maybe 6 or 8 inches. We were still able to get the sections through the canyons. Chaco Canyon was probably the most difficult leading up to Chaco Canyon, going out through Pump Canyon. There were some really tight areas, but it was very feasible. At the end of the day, and Bill put in our second book that on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most difficult, moving this craft, again, using 1948 technology,
Yes.
It would have been a 3. Quite simple.
Really? So I think it's actually great, and people need to I want to emphasize here for listeners, the two of you went through the process of attempting to recreate the excavation of this craft, and you demonstrated that, yes, absolutely, it was totally feasible. Without really knowing the details of the mechanics of how the craft came apart, as it were, I guess that's just something that is kind of a mystery. We don't really know how it happened, presumably.
Right.
Yeah, it's one of those things. But anyway, it was taken out. And did you have any information as to where it was brought? I think in your book you indicate it was most likely brought to Los Alamos National Laboratories, at least initially. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah. Once we clear Liebrook, it's a clear shot to Los Alamos. We've done it. Matter of fact, we did it last April. Once you get out of the town of Liebrook, it's wide open space right to the lab.
Okay. And that would be a very logical place to take this, at least initially.
Right.
Got a very strong concentration of brilliant genius level minds, first of all, and they're deeply embedded in the national security apparatus, and a lot of atomic experts, which is the leading edge of everything at that time. So it would make a lot of sense to bring
the fact that they had sightings in that area.
Oh, yeah. And here's the thing. I'd never really even considered this. The infamous green fireball sightings actually started at the end of 1948. And I don't know, have you wondered this as well? The fact that the craft itself might have been at Los Alamos at that very time.
Right.
I wonder, is this a tie-in with the green fireballs? This was a localized, ongoing UFO phenomenon. It went for months. And it got the attention of many of the highest level scientists and national security people at the time, late December 48 going into 1949. It's very likely the Aztec disc was still at Los Alamos at that time. I might not think that's a coincidence.
It was, and they had viewing of the green fireballs at the same time as this whole Aztec incident was going on. So prior to the Aztec incident, they were still having sights of the green too.
Yeah, I think we got reports that even as early as late 47, the fireballs were streaking across New Mexico. Dr. Edwin Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, I have a letter that he wrote to Lincoln La Paz, a copy of the letter, that is demanding him to get his butt up there now and explain why we are being bombarded with green fireballs on some nights.
This is in 47? 47?
I have to look at the date. It was not around the time of the Aztec. I just thought it was funny since Suzanne and I had our experience with a green fireball that Teller was really annoyed and saying, I need you up here now.
Well, that's interesting. And officially, at least in terms of the UFO research traditionally, I guess I should say, the fireball phenomenon first was being recorded, as far as I know, in late 1948. So it would be a few months after the Aztec recovery. But who knows? It could very well. I certainly could see it having started sooner than that. But it's still, no matter how you look at it, they're very close to each other in time.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
you've got to see that there's a real tie-in there. I just was thinking, well, heck, the craft was brought back to Los Alamos, and so why would it be surprising if 6-7 months later you start getting this phenomenon over that area? In any case, that's apparently where it was brought, I guess, is according to your research.
Yeah. And then late 50s, we have folks that we feel are very, very credible. One man in particular that claims he worked on it at Wright-Patterson. And I have, at this point, I have no reason not to believe him. He paid real estate taxes in Dayton, Ohio at the time. His daughter was enrolled in an elementary school at the time. The company he worked for was later acquired by a New York corporation. The machine he claims they were using on the craft, he actually wrote the operations manual for it. So far, I have not found any chink in the armor, if you know what I mean.
And what did he tell you about the craft? What was he able to tell you?
Oh, my God. We interviewed him for hours and hours and hours. It fit the dimensions. He was never, ever told, except for by a nurse, that it came from the Aztec area of New Mexico. The dimensions were accurate. He said it was about 100 feet across.
Yeah.
Everybody was very compartmentalized, so it wasn't like he could stroll around the craft and do anything he wanted. They were bombarding parts of the metal with a machine to try to analyze what exactly it was made out of, what metallurgical substance it was made out of.
When this craft came down, now it hit kind of sandy, loamy, silty type of soil, but still it must have come down hard. And yet, other than the one puncture of the size of a quarter to one of the portals, there apparently was no damage to it. So this was obviously a really tough craft. And so, you've got to assume the material science behind it had to be very advanced. Very advanced. So obviously it would be important to understand.
We negotiated with the Archuleta family for about 3 years to get permission to go on the ranch. And a couple of years ago, Suzanne and I were blessed with being able to go right before our book came out in 2015. And we actually, with a family member, went up on the mesa where the craft allegedly hit. We have a picture of that in our book.
Yes.
And it's kind of ironic. Suzanne pointed this out. Most of that mesa is made out of sandstone, except for where the craft hit. That's made out of volcanic rock. And the whole thing was kind of bugging us before we made the hike up to the top of the mesa. You really wouldn't get sparks off of sandstone. Sandstone's pretty fragile. And when we got up there and we saw the scar where it hit the mesa, that's all volcanic rock.
Well, let me just say this, though. It took us hours to get up to the top because, as we said earlier, it's about 300 feet high. It's a wall of rock, and it's several blocks wide, city blocks wide. And so at the time when we went out there, we had been trying for years, oh my gosh, years trying to get in there to see if we could find it. And Scott actually on this particular trip had a broken rib. So it was Krista, the granddaughter, Scott and I, and we were walking around. It was hot. We were tired. We hiked all over looking for any area that didn't have sandstone. Finally, it was a couple hours had gone by. Krista and I had looked a variety of places, and I said, I'm really worried about Scott. If he does not come back in the next 15 minutes, then we're going to have to do something because he's got that broken rib, and I'm really concerned. Well, pretty quick, he comes walking around the corner, just by coincidence at that time, and his face was dragging. Again, we were exhausted. He just kind of stumbled over, and I said, oh, honey, I felt tears. I really did. I said, dang it, we worked so hard to get here, and I'm sorry that we didn't find it. And he just didn't even change expression in his face. He just said, I found it. And I said, what? I mean, I can feel right now the goose pimples on my skin when I think about, I could just cry now thinking about it. And I looked at him and I said, what? What did you say? And we were so thirsty and just, oh my God. And he said, I found it. And I said, oh my God, you're kidding. And I'm just freaking out.
Yeah.
And he said, and I got a picture of it. Well, he had to come down, hang down with a broken rib with my iPhone and take a picture. And so, when people say research, are you boots on the ground? Uh-huh. Yeah.
Just hearing a story like this, the two of you are just an inspiration to all of us. I mean, the fact that you just work together so beautifully as a married couple and as a research team, I love that. And the other thing I want to point out is there's a photograph of what you're describing in your book. I'm looking at it as we speak here. And yeah, it's a very interesting photograph. And you can really see that this would be a likely scar. I mean, the bluff, it's like something is torn out of it.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's very evident when you study the picture that this could very well have been exactly what you're describing, that this is where the saucer impacted it.
And if you were looking at erosion and figure, well, something that maybe it just eroded from water and fell off, erosion would go vertically. This is horizontal.
This is horizontal. Yes.
Yeah. So there's no way. And again, it's the nature of the rock in that little area. I mean,
it's maybe 100 feet of volcanic rock on that whole mesa, meaning a section, like a volcanic shaft. The irony is, if you took a laser scope off a rifle, and if you stood at the gate where Valentin Archuleta was standing, and where he pointed to the family and said that's where it hit, you'd be absolutely dead on to where that scar is.
Oh, wow. So the line of sight was perfect. He had the correct line of sight. It's in the right location, you're saying, and it shows the right sign. So, yeah.
But you can imagine their apprehension that they didn't want people crawling all over their property, the liability, and people get crazy. Even out at the crash site in Aztec, they've chipped away pieces of the slab. Everybody wants to be part of the action, but it's really not very respectful of the integrity of the history of it.
No, exactly. Yeah, that's a real shame.
I can honestly say I don't blame the Archuleta family, and we were grateful respectfully to go on and take that picture. And like I said, they're wonderful people, but I don't blame them at all for wanting their privacy.
Tracy's just asking me one more thing if we can get into, which is the newspaper coverage and cover-up that did occur. There was apparently one newspaper account. Was it in the newspaper called The Hustler? I think that was the name of it. They covered this, or am I getting mixed up?
That was a paper back then, but the story has been blown out and convoluted over the years. The actual story supposedly broke in the Aztec Review. Yeah, The Hustler was a paper between the Four Corners area. At one point, you had two newspapers in a town of 6,000 people. You had the Aztec Independent, the Aztec Review.
Those are the days.
One was for, the one was for the very, very conservative Republicans, and one was for the very, very liberal Democrats. And
nothing ever changes, does it?
What's that?
Nothing ever changes, does it?
Nothing changes, right? But I got a kick out of how a town supposedly could try to support two newspapers with 6,500 people. It turns out it didn't.
Okay.
One went out. The conservative paper stayed. They went out of business a number of years ago. We interviewed the entire family and know that I've gone through the archives. Suzanne's gone through the archives. Brooks Marshall's gone through all the microfiche. And there was a funny article written about the Aztec crash that I think people like maybe Linda confused with a real story on the Aztec crash.
Oh, Linda Moulton Howe.
Yeah, because she was given the story. Unfortunately, at the time, she was not able to archive the microfiche because the reader was broken and nobody had organized all the years of newspaper. Once all that got fixed, we spent hours and hours at the archive going through it. And it was a tongue-in-cheek article written about it, and it was done in like 52, so it had nothing to do with the 48.
So is there any reason to think there was an initial newspaper article that was purged or not, in your opinion?
No, the Bauer family, the son and his wife are still alive. Suzanne and I have had lunch with him, gone up to Colorado, met with him, and he worked at the newspaper until it closed. And no, he is correct, because we've gone back and checked. There was never an article written about it other than, way after the crash.
Gotcha.
However, the owner of the Farmington newspaper was also affiliated with other newspapers.
Yeah.
And we had the opportunity to read some papers that were never disclosed in the newspaper that discuss it.
Yeah, but they were years later.
They were years
later. 4
Okay.
years later.
All right. Well, I'm glad we cleared that up a bit then.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break. I'm Richard Dolan here with Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. We're talking about the Aztec UFO case of 1948. We will be right back. Welcome back. I'm here with Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. Let's jump right back into the Aztec UFO case. I wonder if this is a good time for us to switch gears and get into how this story broke in the late 40s and early 50s with Frank Scully and the really nasty, underhanded manner of the destruction of that story by J.P. Cahn.
If I could start with something, I want to touch something as we go into Scully.
Yeah.
At the crash site, before the craft was moved, world-class scientists were brought in to work on the craft in their areas of expertise. And that's partly how it was learned how to dismember it.
Mm-hmm.
So that craft would have been sitting there for a while because it takes time to bring those scientists in, I would think.
It was pretty quick.
Yeah, they got there pretty quick. They were flown into Durango on a C-47, which was a civilian, military version of the DC-3. And they were there within a matter of days.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were there for 2 weeks. They had a nurse that was there and watching over them, timing the amount of time that they're in the craft because there was nausea and vomiting from certain people when they would be in more than 20 minutes. So there was a nurse that was there also, plus the military folks.
Wait, I want to back up. I want, that's really important. So you're saying when the scientists went into the craft, am I understanding? They could not be in for longer than 20 minutes.
That would be the max. They preferred they were only in there for 15. And they had literally a nurse there with a stopwatch and would time a scientist go in, he'd come out, another scientist would go in. And the guy that we're interviewing that claimed to have worked on it at Wright-Pat, he knew about that too. He was the one that said, well, up to 7 years ago, that nurse was still alive. And we're looking for her, obviously. But they were limited to the same thing. If they were not on the outside bombarding the metal and taking meter readings, if they had to go inside the craft, which was only a few times, they were limited to 15 to 20 minutes.
I'm wondering where that came from. Was that out of Scully, or is that something that you guys came up with, that you learned?
We researched it.
You did.
We researched that.
That's fascinating.
Now, these scientists, then as the craft is moved and certain parts taken certain areas of the country to study, the scientists, when they would come together, had a conversation about the fact of how important it was to get this information out. They felt. And there's a remarkable story about Dr. Tate. And if we have time, I'll tell you that story. It's very, very well worth it. But
sure.
So the scientists would come together and they decided that it needed to be shared with the world. And the military and the government had no desire to do that. So they had to find someone that would be able to share this information while protecting them. And I think Frank Scully does not get nearly the attention and the accolades that he should have. And I often wondered early on, why did they choose Frank Scully? And you'll hear people discredit him and say, oh, he only wrote Vanity Magazine and all these entertainment magazines. But he was a prolific writer. And from the time he was in college, he was a very, very sick man and had body parts removed, limbs, and was not in very good health. But he was such a prolific writer and such a quality writer that he was able to cover all of his college, everything, and all of his medical expenses in advance. Then he goes on to marry and was able to have really quite a wealthy lifestyle with all of his children and his family. The reason that I say that is he was a very devoted person. He was a Catholic person who had practiced Catholicism and was very active in the Catholic Church, was very well known to many famous people, very philanthropic. And here's where I think it takes it to a whole new level. The type of writing that he did sometimes was ghostwriting for people. If you've ever had somebody ghostwrite something for you, you would want them to be a person that you can trust impeccably and that you know is going to take care of you.
Yeah.
Likewise, he had people come and stay, whether it was Hollywood people or just friends, down and out neighbors. If they had a problem or there were issues in their life that they needed kept private, they would go to him. He would take them under his wing and take care of them and never disclose any of that information. I personally believe that is why they chose him to be the person that released the information on Aztec, is they knew he was a person that had incredible ethics and that they could trust. And to his grave, he would not say who those scientists were.
I'm so glad you mentioned this, Suzanne. And anyone who hasn't read Behind the Flying Saucers, and I have to confess it's been a while for me, but I did read it. It's a really well-written book. And when you get into Scully, he's actually a very sophisticated thinker. He was a thoughtful man, and it comes through very clearly on every page of that book. So it's a shame that it was trashed so severely by J.P. Cahn, but I guess we'll get to that. But you're suggesting that Scully was approached actively because he was such an exceptional journalist, a really good journalist, and that's interesting.
He was approached at first by Silas Newton, and
can we talk about Silas Newton and his story and how he got involved in all of this?
Putting it in the Reader's Digest condensed form, in looking over their FBI files, which we have more than you can get today on Silas Newton, and we have 256 pages of Leo Gebauer's, which you cannot get at all. That's now been moved to the National Archives. Back in the late 40s, before 48, in the FBI files, both Leo Gebauer and Silas Newton look as though they have just gone through a background check by the FBI. They talk about their political party affiliation, how much money they have, how much cash on hand, who their friends are. They talk about no known ties to the Communist Party.
Right, these are the FBI files on these two men, you're saying?
Yes,
right, so
I have the FBI files, less a couple hundred pages on both Silas Newton and Leo Gebauer. But so here it is that it looks like both of them have gone through very intense scrutiny by the FBI. Kind of like somebody that's applied for a compartmentalized security clearance for Los Alamos or Fermi National Lab or Argonne, whatever. It's kind of interesting. It's like World War II's over, and yet the FBI is doing a rather intense background check on both of them. Well, as we have spent 30-some years researching these guys, and I've had the pleasure of going out to dinner with Leo Gebauer's daughter and her husband being the former bookkeeper of Leo Gebauer's company.
Okay.
We learned that Leo Gebauer worked for Air Research there in Phoenix. He jokingly would call himself doctor, but he was not the Dr. G that Scully talks about. Scully admits that Dr. G is a composite of 8 to 9 scientists.
Yeah.
He was very creative. He's an engineer at Air Research. He has a side business where he builds beautiful custom homes. And he has an electronics business, mail order TV parts, because of his passion for electronics. Silas Newton, on the other hand, in 1948, he was worth $25 million. That's not only us confirming that, that's the FBI confirming that when they start their investigation into him in 1950. They're talking about his net worth. So you have two guys that are made out by the media to be almost like bunco artists, con men. Yeah.
Right. I mean, Newton was an oil man, right? He owned oil rigs.
He owned oil rigs. He owned oil. Scully best describes it. He can find oil where no one else can. And he was a doodlebugger. And a doodlebugger, to your audience, is a machine that every oil man plays with. It'll find oil or water, anything liquid. And if you remember a couple of years ago, the ExxonMobil commercial talks about the machine that they use in satellites that flies over certain areas, and with ultrasound waves and other top secret things that can find oil. Well, that's exactly what Leo Gebauer and Silas Newton did. The only thing they made a mistake, and they told people, wink, wink, it's made with alien technology. Wink, wink. But we have spent literally, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of hours going over their records, their corporate records, their personal records,
Right.
The FBI files, Newton Oil Company in Colorado, the rediscovery of the Langley oil fields in Colorado. By the way, the Gebauers still pull oil off of that as we're talking.
Uh-huh.
So that was a hell of a rediscovery of an oil field. The other thing, and talking to the old oil guys in Farmington and Aztec, who all knew Silas, the big oil companies like the Phillips brothers that brought us Phillips 66, they started in Aztec. Well, actually, it started in St. Louis, but moved to Aztec. They would pump an oil well for a while and say, well, it's dry. And Silas Newton would buy it for $25 and pull another 100,000 barrels of oil out. In the Hart Canyon, Largo Canyon area, you have two things going for you: natural gas and crude oil.
Mm-hmm.
My brother-in-law, I used to laugh. I'd say, how'd it go today? He'd say, we drilled a hole and hit that damn crude oil. I'd say, well, most people would be happy. Well, we got to bring in trucks and pump it out and truck it out of here. The gas, natural gas, we just hook up to a pipeline to get down to Gallup and into the free market.
Way easier, yeah. But what you're saying here, well, I just want to back up. So with Newton, the impression that I'm getting is when he said, we're using alien technology, he wasn't serious about that. And there's no reason to think that he was serious with anyone.
No.
But it's important because Scully's getting this information. J.P. Cahn learns about it, wants to do a book with Scully. Scully's like, no, thanks, I got this on my own. Cahn gets a vendetta, it seems, against Scully and tries to smear his key witnesses that he knows about, which is Newton and Gebauer, and paints them in a series of articles as these sleazy con men and saying, we're going to use alien technology to find your oil for you. And Cahn's really misrepresented that.
Well, to start with J.P. Cahn, he had a desk at the San Francisco Chronicle. He, at the time that he went after Scully, he told Scott Newberry, his boss at the paper, that he was working on a big story and he was going to buy it, and the San Francisco Chronicle was going to have the exclusive. And he's referring to Scully's book.
Yeah.
He meets with Scully. Scully's like, are you kidding me? I got people lined up to publish this. In negotiations with one right now. Turned out that was Henry Hoyt and Company. Of course, JP's side of the story is I offered him $25,000. Scully's rebuttal to that was, well, it was more like a couple $100, and after expenses, probably $25. It goes on and on. Well, anyway, I said Scott Newhouse is what I meant. Named the town of Newhouse, California, is named after his family. They go back and forth. Scully says, "Look, the book's not for sale," and J.P. Cahn looked kind of bad. Talking to the former employees out there, I went out for a week, and it just seemed like he had a black eye. And he was embarrassed, and he wasn't used to being embarrassed because he was the only child from a wealthy family and was used to getting his way. So he goes out with True Magazine and writes a very negative article on Scully's book, talks about criminal activity, blah, blah, blah. And J.P. Cahn was so well connected. We have copies of the letter. He actually writes personally to J. Edgar Hoover and says, hey, these guys are talking about a down saucer. They're talking about using alien technology in their doodlebug machines. And Hoover responds to Cahn in a letter, which we have a copy of. Thank you, the FBI. Says, yeah, we'll look into it. Well, they took it to 3 judges, one in Colorado, one in New Mexico, and one in Arizona, and said, this complaint, we need to prosecute these guys. And the only thing, and all 3 judges said, this is a civil case, get it out of here, it's not a criminal case. And the only thing that they had done, they took a check from Herman Flater for money toward the investment of a doodlebug machine, only because Silas Newton had invested $250,000 in Flater's Get Healthy machine. This is one of these machines you climb in, electronics go off, bells and whistles, and it was going to cure you for anything you had.
Aha.
So we have two guys conning each other, so to speak. Anyway, a constable ended up taking it to a magistrate, and the only thing they could get him on was taking Flater's check from Colorado and depositing it in the bank in Phoenix, Arizona. So they called that transportation of stolen money across state line. That charge wouldn't stick anywhere else at any time, but there is such a vendetta with the FBI to find out, and the FBI could care less about a health machine or a doodle bug. They want it, and they say it in writing. We want to find out who Scully's source is on the flying saucer. That's why they put them all through this big thing of smoke and mirrors. And, of course, they were convicted of taking a check across state lines in Colorado, and nothing ever happened. I mean, Newton actually sat down and forced the court to tell him what the court costs were and wrote him a check right after the trial.
Right.
So it was a big...
But it smeared his reputation, and
right,
that was the whole point of it.
It was to ruin the reputation of three people, Frank Scully, Silas Newton, and Leo Gebauer.
Now, the thing is, how did Newton and Gebauer figure into this? So were they part in some way or another? It was Gebauer. He was one of the scientists, or one of the technicians, I guess we should say, that Scully folded into Dr. G?
No.
No? Okay.
Nothing to do with it.
So how do they figure in?
They figure in because the one scientist that was up in Colorado had dealings with Silas Newton. Basically, Newton was tied into a lot of technology. Bruce Cabot belonged to the Beverly Hills Country Club, where Silas Newton was a member. And one day, Newton was talking about the Aztec crash and how they had a little size of a transistor radio that was recovered off the craft. And on the hour, on the half hour, on the quarter hour, or whatever, it would make a chime noise. And Bruce Cabot, who had been in military intelligence in World War II, thought, if this is true, this should not be floating around a bar at a country club. So independently, not knowing that J. Edgar Hoover had already been contacted by Cahn, Bruce Cabot says, hey, it's my patriotic duty to inform you that a man here is claiming alien technology in his possession, and that stirs the old pot even a little harder at that point. So it was coming from different directions to the FBI that this technology is floating around in private hands.
This is the source of the famous Guy Hotel memo, Special Agent Guy Hotel to the FBI. It's the most famous, it's the most searched FBI document, I think, on the entire FBI website to this day. From March of 1950.
And I think the name blacked out is Bruce Cabot because we have a copy where it's not redacted.
That memo, just for anyone who hasn't looked at it, describes stories of alien bodies, roughly, I think, 3 feet tall, and the recovery of a craft and so forth. So it's interesting. And, researchers would say, well, it refers to the discredited Aztec crash. But now, after all the work you guys have done, I think it's a really important part of our history, and it's of legitimate interest, I would say. But it comes from Newton, ultimately. Newton's sparked all of us.
Yes, I think it was Newton who really got the ball rolling with Scully and said, you got to dig into this, and I can bring you people. I think it was more Newton bringing the scientists to Scully than Leo Gebauer.
So you're thinking, Newton and Gebauer both had detailed FBI investigations, and most likely, I guess the idea is that they were being cleared maybe in connection with the Aztec event. Is that what you're thinking?
I can't make that connection because it almost looks like they're being cleared for a project prior to 48.
But somehow, in one way or another, Newton's clearances, I guess the hypothesis is, allowed him access in some way or another to something having to do with Aztec. Like that's
correct.
You're thinking. Okay.
Yeah.
So we don't know the details exactly, but somehow Newton was in a good position to have learned enough about Aztec to go to Scully and say, hey, you got to look into this. That's the kind of theory we're working with.
And
okay.
Silas Newton wrote a book on the entire Aztec and his dealings It's sort of a tell-all book, and we found that manuscript at the University of Wyoming in Laramie. It was never published.
I never knew about this book.
Yeah, parts of that. See, when we go through a publisher, like our last book, we're limited to 250, whatever pages. And when we do our own book, we're not going to be limited to how many pages. It's going to be a lot more than 300, I'm sure.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that.
I think when you look at the whole Silas Newton-Gaybauer deal, there's so much more to it than what we have found so far. And I don't know how far we can keep digging, because it's not just a rich oil man and a gadget guy that sells radio tubes through the mail order. This guy was a legitimate engineer / technical person at Air Research. The B-48 bomber, I believe, or 46, was the first bomber that had a pressurized cockpit. And if you dig into Air Research, Leo Gaybauer's name is on the patent. One of the names on the patent.
That's really important, because the way they've been portrayed, and we mentioned Carl Flock, I think, in the previous segment, and we all knew Carl Flock when he was alive.
Yep.
He did so much debunking work on a variety of UFO cases, like Roswell and Aztec. And the way that he characterized Silas Newton and Gaybauer, Leo Gaybauer, he did it in such a way, he was so confident. He said, yeah, they were con men. And J.P. Cahn was a great professional journalist. And he just made these statements so matter-of-factly that if you, the listener, didn't know any better, you would believe Carl Flock. You'd think, well, it's an open and shut case. These people were hoaxing. And yet his information was so wrong. And I don't want to go so far as to say that he was intentionally lying. Maybe he was, but it's easy for people back in the 1970s and 1980s who didn't know any better to say, yeah, J.P. Cahn had it. He did good investigative journalism. He exposed the hoax. Without doing any additional research, people would never know that. And it came down to the two of you to do that research and expose J.P. Cahn for the mendacious, vindictive person that he was. Really just tried to destroy a story because it seemed like he made himself look bad by promising his own publisher things that he couldn't deliver, and then went after Scully and went after Scully's witnesses. I mean, ridiculous.
Very large ego, very, very big ego. And he had time on his hands. He never had to work a day in his life. And I personally feel like the more intelligent that you are, the more you have to take that energy and put it in a positive direction. And I think equally, the more intelligent you are, if you don't put it in an intelligent direction, it goes destructive.
Yeah,
and I think that's what happened to JP.
Cahn needed to take up watercolor painting or something.
Yes.
That's
something.
Right.
I took one of his best friends out to lunch in California.
Oh.
Robert McClay. Robert did a lot of the artwork. Matter of fact, Robert did the artwork for J.P. Cahn's UFO book. He did the cover for it, and I have the original watercolor. Suzanne and I have it. That was never published. All of a sudden, JP just said, "Nah, I'm not going to publish it. The hell!" It was his rebuttal to Frank Scully.
Oh, really?
He was an egomaniac. Anybody that worked with him would tell you. Even after he left the San Francisco Chronicle, he still had a desk there and a telephone. So it was like he had a private office he could go in and use anytime he wanted. But it's just sad that this was probably one of the best UFO cases in history that got destroyed very well by the United States government. J. Edgar Hoover had played a big role in it. And it's a shame. That's all I can say. It's a shame it went the direction it did.
Do you think Hoover knew the truth about Aztec
Yes.
and worked overtly to squash it? You do think that? Why do you say that?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay.
I forget who we interviewed. I'd have to go back. We've been doing this so many years. There's certain things that should jump right out don't. The FBI really, in their own words, they weren't really out to punish Scully. They just wanted to know who was leaking him the information.
Yeah.
And it's a document from the FBI. It's not. We're not after Frank Scully to put him in jail. We're after Frank Scully to find out what scientists are leaking him this information.
And the other thing that you didn't mention, at least you weren't, I wanted you to be a little more clear, is the fact that Gaybauer's FBI file And Silas Newton's, I think, it's not just that there's less available now than there used to be. It's that there were hundreds of pages of Gebauer's file that have never been released from the FBI.
Yes.
And you got to like ask, what is it?
Why?
Supposed con man. You've got redacted, held back hundreds of pages of information in this man's FBI file. Why? It's all of these years later. And that's another reason, I guess, to assume that Hoover had to have known. These are FBI files that themselves have been held back. So, yeah, presumably there's very sensitive information in there. Right.
I think, too, that JP came around just at about the right time and was really a favor to the FBI.
Yes, absolutely.
The CIA, you know, they really were grateful because he was somebody they could dump this on.
Just for your listeners, we should maybe spend a minute, and I'll make it quick, recapping the Silas Newton FBI file.
Yes, please.
Early on in my investigation, we were able to recover, give or take, 250 pages of Silas Newton. I was on the phone so much to the archivist up in Winchester, Virginia. We're on first name basis. And I'd start the conversation. How'd your son do in soccer the other night? Oh, Scott, he did great. Thanks for asking. You know, we really became friends. And I appealed to the FBI the 211 pages that they would not release, no matter how redacted. And I appealed it. They denied my appeal. And I came back some years later and requested all the FBI files on Silas Newton. And I don't know what the exact number was, but it was like 50 pages.
Okay.
I go back to the FBI. I said, wait a minute, on this date, under this file number, you released this many. And I appealed to get the rest. Well, that's all you're getting now. So the more it seemed like Aztec was coming back around, the tougher the FBI got. Now, Leo Gebauer, I have a big chunk of his file, but I did not get it from the FBI. Nick Redfern did years ago. When I went to try to get it, Nick gave me the file. I have it here with Suzanne and I. And they withheld, again, about 200 pages to Nick. So I went back to the FBI and said, I'd like the copies of the FBI file on Leo Gebauer. And they came back and said, request denied. And I went through the appeal process, and finally they came back and said, we've moved that file to the National Archives in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Mike Price flew up to the National Archives, and at the end of the day, they said, Mr. Price, we have some horrible news for you. We're really sorry. Those files are over in Suitland, Maryland. And Mike said, really? And they said, yeah, well, we have an archive here. We have one in Virginia and then over in Maryland.
Yeah.
And you'll have to contact them. So, of course, Mike comes back feeling kind of rejected. And we contacted them, and they said, absolutely not. That file is never going to be released. Quit asking. So we have a mail order, if you want to listen to the debunkers, a mail order gadget electronics guy and a millionaire oil field guy, yet their files are smothered.
That's a good place to wind down this segment of my interview with Scott and Suzanne Ramsey, authors of the Aztec Incident. You will not want to miss the third and final segment of this interview, in which we go into the identities of the chief scientists involved in the initial study of the craft, and in which the Ramseys reveal the name of the very successful tech company that they ended up creating in its aftermath. If you like what's on my channel, please help me by subscribing, getting notifications, and liking the video. You can also see what I'm up to at richardolanmembers.com. Always lots happening there. Meanwhile, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.